Lawrence is a man of great intellectual brilliance and really bringing our ideas to look at ecosocial theory. One had to go into the work of Nancy Krieger from Harvard, which is about a broad and complex theory with the explicit purpose of describing and explaining causal relationships in disease distribution. And so when I recall as I was putting these sides together, that the first major issue around global mental health came from the Lancet, and then there was this article by Pamela Collins and Vikram Patel and colleagues about the business of grand challenges in global mental health. And Lawrence had held an advanced study institute in 2012 about this, and two of his graduate students made a presentation on this issue. Vikram Patel in 2012 at that conference talked about the scale up of coverages for services mental health disorders in all countries, especially low and middle income countries. On the other hand, Derek Summerfield talked about the mental health industry being out of control with its white Western imposed diagnosis. The rape of therapeutics are what imperialism is all about. And of course, my comment was, cockroach don't business in foul fight. Because the reality is that we have had an approach to global mental health for the last 50 years. And so when Lawrence asked me to make this presentation, he really had to remind me that he really wanted me to focus on the ecosocial issues and the mental health promotion issues, which I'm going to try and do. So when you look at this model for health promotional intervention, there are really a number of stages: policy, and then community, which then goes into the organizational, it then goes into the interpersonal, and then finally to the intrapersonal, and has all of these components as part of the ecosocial model. Lawrence, he in celebrating in celebrating Duncan said, of partnering Caribbean countries to expand knowledge transfer while building infrastructure, and believe that global health work involves each nation's ownership of their creativity and their authenticity in the shared legacy. So we're going to try to present this afternoon the view of the ecosocial model of the Caribbean and the Jamaican issue in mental health. We have to start at what we have to see as the beginning, because for the past 5 centuries, the Europeans have been fighting over possession of the Caribbean, and still are, and they still own the Caribbean, from one end in the west to the other end in the southeast. And the Europeans still own the Caribbean. They still own us. I grew up in colonial Jamaica, where there were 5,000 British troops stationed to rule over us. And they were soldiers of the Duke of Cornwall Light Infantry. They were our gendarmes of that time. I was an adolescent at that time, and it had a profound effect on me. So let's recognize that the Europeans have been in the Caribbean since 1492. And it was the British who introduced into Jamaica slavery as a part of the social engineering issue. It was engineered by brutality and trauma, cruelty and fear, and blacks were considered 3/5 humans. We were not human beings, we were just part animals. Reared for absolute subservience to whites, skewed authority master-servant relationships, and the main objective of ownerships by whites was absolute sexual and vocational exploitation. I really want us to get an understanding of this. And Douglas Hall's book, In Miserable Slavery, really explains this in a wonderful way. In the first part of slavery, the health of slaves was the responsibility of the slave owners, who housed them in plantation hothouses or dungeons. In those early colonial times, a violently mentally ill slave would and could be summarily executed. But whoever heard of a mad slave? Sir Andrew Halliday said mental illness is rare in slaves from the West Indies, Africans, and Welsh and Irish peasants. And of course, it was Samuel Cartwright in the USA who coined the diagnosis Diathesia Ethiopica, which the diagnosable signs included disobedience, answering disrespectfully, and refusing to work. So they've been making diagnoses about us for the last 500 years. Then came the business of the asylum, when psychiatry and internal medicine parted company in the 1700s. This man, Leonard Smith, who's a medical historian, has just written a book about insanity, race, and colonialism and the mental asylums of the Caribbean. Very interesting book. The Jamaica Lunatic Asylum was built in 1862. Len Smith said, "The conclusion is inescapable that measures to remove, sequestrate, and to care for the insane was a central element to Britain's civilizing mission." Now, Len and I have had serious disagreements on that issue. The first black psychiatrist in the Caribbean was Hopton Edward Bond, who started working at the mental hospital in the 1915. He was indeed my granduncle several years ago. Then they had a number of other black psychiatrists who worked in the Jamaican hospital, and this was Bellevue Hospital in 1962. This was Black Rock Mental Hospital in Barbados and St. Anne's Mental Hospital in Port of Spain, Trinidad. They all were of the same plan. They were built by the British on the same architectural and sociological and therapeutic plan. Then we came independence, political independence from Britain. And of course, we then started dealing with the business of this ecosocial model. How do you create a plan to transform this? The PAHO and the WHO recommended deinstitutionalization and community mental health. And Michael Bobron was the first professor of psychiatry in 1965 at the University of the West Indies. So the first thing that we did was to train our own psychiatrists and to train our own psychiatric nurses. And he implemented and taught psychiatry on a 5-bedded unit in the dermatology wards. So the reality is, and then he built a 20-bedded unit and promoted it at that time. And if you can see me right over in this corner when I was a resident, I learned my psychiatry in a general hospital, not in an asylum. And I think it is very critical for you to understand that. Then I spent some time with Maurice Carstairs in Edinburgh, where I learned about rehabilitation and a number of other things. So Duncan asked the question, has the closure of the Victorian Asylum in Jamaica improved the patient's quality of life? And so let's try and look at that. And the Lunatic Asylum was the colonial tertiary care model, and the deinstitutionalization of Bellevue Mental Hospital, which is what was one of my passions in 1974, and this is what I saw, the institutional custodialization. And contrary to what Len Smith said, the Lunatic Asylum was created as an institution of social control for British colonialism, with involuntary incarceration as the primary agency for control. Political activists such as the Rastafari and dreadlocks were viewed as mad people. Thus, people like Bob Marley and his like would have been viewed by the Jamaican population as crazies. And they were incarcerated in prisons and the mental hospitals. Ray Prince, who was also the professor here and Lawrence's predecessors, he also thought Rastafari was a product of delusional cultism. He gave this comment in Ocho Rios in 1969, and a group of Rastafarians nearly keel-hauled him. And at that time, we were looking at the business of ganja and its use, and the use of ganja for treating various conditions. And then we moved into the business of post-colonial assimilation of psychiatry into general medicine in Jamaica. And phase one started with these 4 people who were 2 at the university and 2 in the government services. And we then moved from policy to community to organizational stuff. And I wrote this paper in 1973 for the newspaper, in which I really had to point out that psychiatry, the ugly duckling of medicine, seems about to blossom into the majestic swan of the medical profession. And we were the first wave of psychiatrists that were trained in Jamaica. And then this was the second wave. And then the third wave, and we moved all over the Caribbean, and we started training our own psychiatrists. And we introduced secondary care and community psychiatry. And in that first phase, we moved 19 of the nurses out of the mental hospital into the community. And then we changed the mental hospital law. Trevor Lindsay and myself, there were only 3 of us working in the government service in 1973 when we joined. We went to the Minister of Health and asked him to change the law so that we could have a community mental health law, the deinstitutionalization process, and a new mental health act. That was what I call the Zugzwang process. Zugzwang, German for compulsion to move, is a situation found in chess and other games wherein one player is put at a disadvantage because they must make a move. And so by training our own people and moving the nurses into the community, the whole society was forced to move and forced to think about the mental hospital, which had been created by the British colonizers. So in this phase 2, we established clinics all around the country. And the few psychiatrists we had and the nurses started running clinical services in the general hospitals and in the clinics. We started treating acute psychiatry in open wards of general hospitals. This was quite unique. And is still quite unique. And in fact, the majority of our acute treatment now, to this day, takes place in the acute medical wards of medical hospitals. So, and therefore, we were really making the transformation in this ecosocial approach that we were now moving out into the clinics and Ray Cochran, friend and colleague from Birmingham, came to visit us in 1999 and commented, the big difference is the use of general medical beds in ordinary wards for even quite severely mentally ill patients. And this does avoid stigmatizing them. It puts them into a normal hospital environment. And although I've only seen a little of that, it does seem to work. Well, it's been working for 50 years. And I published this paper in the Psychiatric Services looking at the superior outcome of the treatment of schizophrenia in the open general medical wards. Then we moved to the next issue, which was the gradual deinstitutionalization of the Lunatic Asylum. Deinstitutionalization was a common phenomenon all across the world. However, after John F. Kennedy and the Madison model and those issues in the 50s and 60s, people just threw the patients out into the street. We decided we weren't going to do that. We were going to have a gradual process where you had the patients going in and patients coming out. And then you had the acute services, you treat them. Then you would bypass them into the community. Then you would rehabilitate those who were left. And then finally, when you got through all of that, then eventually you'd close the mental hospital. That was the plan, the ecosocial plan of the time. In 1974, there were more than 3,000 patients. That's what I saw when I went there. And this was the kind of ward facility that you see all over the world and in Africa and various places. And of course, we created a staged process of rehabilitation using Maxwell Jones techniques and Kamenov techniques from Leningrad Institute in Russia. And we started putting people to work as part of the vocational program. And so, Duncan's second question, have the non-technical changes in the care of the person developed in Jamaica been responsible for the demonstrable transformation of mental health in that country? Well, implicit in this, he's saying that there has been a transformation, and he wants to know what has caused it. We then produced the business of cultural therapy, and we used the technique of historiography, which is the philosophy and methodology of history using written documents, which is what has been in vogue for a while. But then we combine that with the oral tradition of the African peoples, which had been identified by Erna Brodpub. And we were working on Carl Jasper's thought that it was time for psychopathologists, psychiatrists, and historians to work together. And of course, now the history of the Jamaican people had now to be told by the psychologists. So we created what is called an ethnohistorical meeting, and then the business of psychohistoriographic cultural therapy, in which psychohistoriography, the central thesis, identified that European colonization of Africa and the Americas and the New World was essentially a delusional idea. The European delusion, the fixed false belief, all of this is mine, and all therein belongs to me. The European delusion, all that I can see is mine. That's the etiology of poverty in our region. So taking action on the social determinants of health, using the images of Frantz Fanon from Martinique and other Caribbean psychiatrists, psychiatric understanding is incomplete and invalid without the consideration of political expression and exploitation. And so I wrote a book on this psychohistoriography in which I have explained the concept of the European American psychosis, as I call it. So first of all, you have a graph, you have white Europe's ideas, and you have the black rest of the world, and then you have a timeline running in the middle, the delusion of discovery, we call them invaders, the delusion of ownership, we call them thieves, institutionalization of genocide, we call them murderers. Slavery, the ultimate delusion, we call them plunderers. The delusion of capitalism, we call them the creators of poverty. The early encapsulation of the delusion, the fight for emancipation and freedom, the depersonalization in the delusion, migration and indenture, the contemporary encapsulation of the delusion, the independence movements around the world. The empire fights back, still fighting. The intifada is the result of all of this. That's the basis of psychohistoriographic cultural therapy. We then created a cultural therapy program to put these conceptual ideas together in song and dance of the Jamaican people. And we built our own garden theater in 1978 out of bamboo, out of brick, and we performed Magnificent Irations, which was the history of madness based on the Jamaican perception. the history of our madness, magnificent irations. And the community was part of this, and they took part in this whole process. And that was now the basis of our ecosocial model for health promotion intervention. And we published this in the American Journal, Hospital and Community Psychiatry in 1989. And we use, of course, a number of well-known words, the sociodrama, the dynamic of Moreno, and we were revolutionizing treatment throughout the country. So this is what happened with our deinstitutionalization process. This is where we started in 1860. This is where we are, this is 2010, and the end part of this we'll come to in a moment. This is what's happened with the Bellevue resident population over this period. And if you look at what has happened in the United States, the institutionalization has led to there being a rise in the people, in the mentally ill, in the prisons. And you see the gap widening. But if you look at what has happened in Jamaica, this is quite the opposite, because both these figures are trending together. This is the prison beds, and these are the mental hospital beds. They are trending together. There are very few of our mentally ill patients in our prisons. There are very few homeless people on the streets, as opposed to what's happened in the deinstitutionalization process in Europe and North America. And now, at the end of this period, after 45 years, 85% of the patients there are long-stay destitute inmates over the age of 65. And of course, we have been putting all of these things through the transformation of mental health legislation right into the community and into the psychiatric admissions in this period. These are all psychiatric admissions. The red line is Bellevue. The green line is psychiatric units in general hospitals. And the purple line is open medical wards admissions. The majority of patients, 83%, are now being treated in the general hospitals of the country in Jamaica. So we don't really have a great mental health system. It may not be a Cadillac system, but it's a great Volkswagen. 24-hour response time, island-wide. 2,500 severely admissions annually. 3 of 4 psychiatric admissions to general hospitals, 40 to 60% of mild to moderate mentally ill patients by the general practitioners, treated by the general practitioners, and psychotropic medication is subsidized by the National Health Fund. As Peter was talking about this morning, I was thinking about how you really don't have wealth. You don't have to have money to transform a particular nation and to transform poverty. That's what I was thinking about. So Duncan's third question: has the mental health transformation of the care of the person been the consequence of these non-technical changes and not new drugs or psychopharmaceuticals or new brain discoveries of the neuroscientists and the geneticists? Integration with primary care services is what's been happening throughout the 45-year period until this particular time. This is my young colleague and collaborator who is doing some fantastic work in Kingston and St. Andrew, which will be, he has presented here before, and he has created the integration of mental health services with general practitioners all across the country. There are 2,000 general practitioners, all trained at the University of the West Indies. We have trained our own people, and we have kept them there. We have stopped them from coming to Canada and to the United States. We have kept them at home to make the transformation at home. We have shared some with you, though, so you can have a few. You can borrow a few. So let's look at the role of mental health, of the media in mental health promotion. We have had a series of radio psychiatry programs in which we deal with psychiatry on the radio. It's been It's been reported in the press. We have written about it. And the terms mad and mental have become partially sanitized in the contemporary Jamaican culture. It's been in drama, it's been in dance, it's been in plays, and it's in the local music. Kiprich and Predator, Mad, Sick, Head No Good. Volume.
South Africa.
These are poor people in the inner city. Mad sick and the wood. 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 The mad message. The mad message speaks to an attitude of social defiance emerging out of poverty-stricken political garrisons by rebellious inner city youth. The mad message is articulated clearly in the psychological deinstitutionalization that Rob Whitley and I have written about. That's reduced stigma in this particular period of time, even though it still remains. And this is the question 4. Can the medicine of the mind work with the same epistemology as the medicine of the tissues? Creating primary mental health interventions, we created the Caribbean Institute of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, and to create this mental health promotion cycle, assessment, organization, implementation, sustenance. Unmasking social psychopathology. Some of our best minds have turned to crime. 2/5 of our population are eligible for diagnosis of personality disorder. And the problem statement that our Jamaican people as children are suffering, high physical abuse and neglect, high sexual molestation, 40% teenage pregnancies, 50% dropout rates. And therefore this CARIMENSA has been creating a particular service to be able to transform this, to prevent these things from happening. So we are situated in downtown Kingston, and then we started with the Dreamer World Cultural Therapy. First of all, in one school, and we reported it in the Canadian Journal, Jaswan Guzda, Hilary Robertson Hickling, Vanessa Paisley, and myself. It's well worth the read. That was the pilot project, and it produced significant improvement in school social behavior and also academic performance. And then Grand Challenges in Canada gave us a grant that allowed us to scale it up to 4 schools. And this is when the start of the scale up, and this scale up that Duncan and Jasmine and Hillary and myself were involved with, that went to 4 schools. And this is what the children produced. This booklet is outside. You can purchase a copy of the work of the children, the people who were regarded as the worst performing children in the 3rd year grades. Little volume, please. And that was the performance of the 100 children that had been regarded as rejects in the school. And they had just flipped and transformed and become now the leaders of the school and becoming the leaders of our society. Has medicine of the mind turned colonial psychiatry inside out? So we entered the Turning the World Upside Down competition in the London School of Hygiene in 2013. And we won. And then we expanded it into 35 schools and then into 70 schools because the Ministry of Education saw the importance of it and started funding this project. And we are now going to go to the 541 primary schools. And this is the team: Hilary Robertson Hickling, Jeffrey Walcott, Duncan Pedersen, myself, and Jaswan Guzda. And it is this collaboration with Canada now and McGill that has been really helping us to make this transformation. And it is this why I really am paying tribute to Duncan. Can the medicine of the mind work with the same epistemology as the medicine of the tissues? And very recently, just before I came out, the Auditor General came out with this fantastic report about the Bellevue Hospital. And this is the last zugzwang, because the reality is that the Auditor General is now forcing the society to close down the mental hospital. We are not doing it. It is happening by the people themselves. And so by the next time we speak to you, the mental hospital may not be anymore. And it's last week, it was the front page of the Sunday Gleaner, and it's really all about the health promotion cycle. I want to end with making a comparison. If you look at what I have here is the colonial mental health, the Jamaican mental health innovations, and the Jamaican outcome here. And these are the global mental health goals that Collins and Patel's article in the Lancet said. We have met all of them except in these three. We have created things that they don't have. And that's why I said cockroach no business in foul fight. Because what global mental health does not have is the understanding that you have to counteract colonial mental health problems if you're going to transform mental health around the world. So, and if you look at all of the rest of them, yes, we have met all the things that the global mental health have, but they haven't met what we want. So, cockroach don't business in foul fight. And I wrote a poem about this. When a wise man tell you, say cockroach don't business in a foul fight, you know some might is right and cockroach will get bite. You can read the English language translation down here. But if you think say foul spell foul, the cockroach will think say him no have a fret, as foul is just a fart and the foul fight never did start. So cockroach go where him don't belong and turn wise man wisdom in a for him song. Where cock mouth kill cock and cockroach business seal up and padlock. So when you hear say rock stone or river bottom don't know sun hot, you will know say wise man no want you figure that when you don't know about something, you must keep your mouth pan lock. British colonialism taught us. First we put on silly clothes, then we steal your shit. So we have to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. And I've just written a book about this, Owning Our Madness, Facing Reality in Post-Colonial Jamaica. One love, brothers and sisters, one heart.